Welcome back to the Deep Dive. It is Monday, January 26th, 2026. And look, if you've scrolled through your newsfeed in the last day or so, you've seen the words peace talks.
Oh, they're everywhere.
It's everywhere. And honestly, it feels like the entire world is, I don't know, collectively holding its breath right now.
It really does.
Yeah.
It's that specific kind of tension. A mix of high hopes and, frankly, deep cynicism.
Yeah.
And just a lot of confusion about what's actually happening behind closed doors.
Exactly. Because on the surface, the headline seems pretty simple. Diplomacy is happening. But when you actually, pop the hood and look at the engine of these talks, wow. This is not your grandfather's peace treaty. We're seeing things that look a lot more like a corporate merger than a ceasefire.
It's a whole different animal.
So here's our mission for today. We're going to unpack these trilateral talks happening in Abu Dhabi, U.S., Russia, Ukraine. But we're not just going to look at the handshakes. We're digging into let's call it the hidden layer. We're talking about a massive business deal, profit sharing on frozen assets, a truly bizarre conversation about Greenland, yes, Greenland, and this very real fear among analysts that this whole thing might just be an elaborate trap.
It's a total split-screen reality. On one channel, you have envoys talking about lithium mines and real estate, and on the other, you have heavy cruise missiles hitting Kyiv. And we have to try and make sense of how those two things are coexisting.
Okay, so let's start with the immediate context. It's January 2026. This war has been grinding on for 4 years, and now for the very first time since the invasion, we have U.S., Russian, and Ukrainian officials all at the same table in Abu Dhabi. I mean, that alone is huge news.
It's historic. Just getting those three parties in a room is a massive diplomatic achievement. And the fact that sources are calling the talks constructive is significant, even if it's just, diplomatic language.
It means nobody's flipped the table over yet.
Exactly.
But, and this is so important, this meeting didn't just happen. It had a prequel that feels like it's straight out of a spy novel. Just a few days ago, on Thursday, January 22nd, President Trump's envoys flew to Moscow.
And we're talking high-level people here, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner. They went and sat down with Vladimir Putin for a 4-hour meeting.
4 hours. That is a long time to sit with Vladimir Putin. And when the Kremlin released their summary of that meeting, the tone was, well, it was surprisingly warm. Yuri Ushakov, the Kremlin's foreign policy guy, called it constructive and trust-based.
Which is practically a love letter in diplomatic terms, especially coming from Moscow right now.
Yeah.
But what's really wild is what they talked about. It wasn't just, artillery shells or border lines in the Donbass. They were talking about the broad potential for U.S.-Russia cooperation, like a partnership.
And this is where that one detail just completely threw me. In between these heavy topics, Ukraine, global security, they discussed Greenland.
It just stops you in your tracks, doesn't it?
It really does. I mean, why, in the middle of negotiating the bloodiest war in Europe since World War II, why are you talking about a giant icy island in the North Atlantic?
Well, that's our first clue that this isn't traditional diplomacy. This is a transactional worldview. If they're talking Greenland, they're really talking about the Arctic. They're talking about new shipping routes opening up as the ice melts. They're talking about rare earth minerals.
So it's about some kind of global realignment.
Exactly. It points to a grand bargain. The U.S. might be saying, we want strategic access here in the north, and Russia is saying, okay, we can talk, but we want concessions over there in the east. It turns the war into just one line item on a much, much bigger balance sheet.
Which brings us perfectly to the business side of this whole thing, because if we look back at Abu Dhabi, the cast of characters tells a really specific story. It's not just diplomats in that room.
No. Running parallel to the political track, there's a working group on economic issues. And just look who's running it. For the U.S., you've got Steve Witkoff, a real estate guy, a finance guy.
And for Russia?
Kirill Dmitriev.
Okay, for anyone who doesn't follow the Russian financial world, who is that?
He's the head of the Russian Direct Investment Fund, the RDIF. He basically holds the checkbook for the Russian state's big international deals. He is not a military strategist. He's a deal maker. Putting him in that chair tells you the peace is being built around money.
So let's get into the numbers, because this Trump plan that was floating around before, the one European allies reportedly hated, it's back. And some of these details are just wild.
They're unprecedented. The core of it seems to be this joint economic framework. The idea is for the U.S. to get into a long-term economic partnership with Russia. But here's the kicker. It involves a $100 billion investment using frozen Russian assets.
Wait, what? Pause there. These are the assets that were sanctioned, frozen when the war began.
Correct. billions just sitting there. The plan is to unfreeze that money and reinvest it into Ukraine. But, and this is the part that is making everyone's jaw drop, the U.S. or U.S.-linked entities would take a 50% profit share from that investment.
Okay, let me get this straight. The assets were frozen as a punishment. Now the idea is to turn that punishment into a venture capital fund for reconstruction, and the U.S. takes half the profit.
That is the proposal on the table. It basically commercializes the end of the conflict. It turns a punitive measure into an investment opportunity.
It sounds less like a Marshall Plan and more like a private equity buyout.
It's a very different diplomatic model for sure.
Yeah.
The logic seems to be, if everyone's making money, Russia gets its capital moving, the U.S. gets a return, Ukraine gets rebuilt, then maybe nobody will have a reason to shoot at each other anymore. It's, peace through profit.
And it's not just the frozen assets. We're also seeing reports about a mineral agreement with Kyiv.
Right. This is the other side of the ledger. Ukraine is incredibly rich in resources. We're talking lithium, titanium, rare earths.
All the stuff you need for the 21st century economy.
Exactly. Electric cars, microchips, advanced weapons. The reports suggest a deal where Washington gets priority access to these resources and then shares the revenue.
So, in a way, Ukraine pays for its own security with its geology.
That's a blunt way to put it, but yeah. It suggests a pay-for-protection kind of model. Washington sends security guarantees or support, but in exchange, American firms get first dibs on Ukrainian lithium.
It's just so cynical, isn't it? But I guess the argument from the negotiators would be, hey, it's better than war.
That's the argument. Cynical but functional seems to be the thinking. But Russia has its own counteroffers here. Putin has suggested that Russian assets frozen specifically in the U.S. could be used to rebuild parts of Ukraine.
And then there was that other detail that just shows how chaotic and global this whole thing is. You mentioned Gaza.
Yes, this is another piece of that grand bargain.
Yeah.
Apparently, Putin pledged to transfer $1 billion in assets to a Gaza peace council that was proposed by Trump.
So we're tying the frozen tundra of Greenland, the lithium mines of the Donbas, and the reconstruction of Gaza all into one massive, complicated financial web.
That seems to be the design. You solve, or at least you appear to be addressing, multiple global problems by just moving money around. It's ambitious, but it's also incredibly fragile. You're balancing the needs of miners in Ukraine, developers in the Arctic, and aid workers in Gaza, all while an active war is going on.
And that's the risk, right? Because while the finance guys are calculating their return on investment, there are security analysts looking at this and just screaming, it's a trap.
Exactly, and we really have to take that skeptic's view seriously. We've been looking at analysis from RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute. These are serious people. Experts like Neil Melvin and Natia Siskuria are basically pouring cold water on this whole constructive vibe.
What's their main worry? Because if I'm in Kyiv and somebody offers me a $100 billion investment fund, that sounds pretty good. So why is RUSI so concerned?
Their number one concern is the stalling theory. Neil Melvin points out that for all this talk about economic deals, Russia hasn't actually budged on its core demands for Ukraine. They haven't withdrawn claims to annex territory. They haven't agreed to real sovereignty for Kyiv.
So the theory is that the Kremlin is just playing for time.
Precisely. By just showing up to these high-profile talks, Russia achieves a huge goal. It breaks its diplomatic isolation. They get the photo ops with U.S. envoys. They look like reasonable partners on the world stage. It normalizes relations without them having to actually stop the war.
And in the meantime, they're rearming.
They're rearming, reorganizing, and just waiting for the West to get tired.
There's an even darker angle to this, though, from Natia Siskuria. She talks about a blame game scenario. Can you unpack that? Because that feels like the real danger.
This is the absolute nightmare scenario for Zelensky. The fear is that Russia, and maybe even the Trump administration, is setting a trap. They go into the talks. They sound reasonable. They talk about joint investment. But then they offer terms that would be political suicide for any sovereign nation to accept.
Like permanently giving up territory or agreeing to never join NATO.
Exactly. Terms that would turn Ukraine into a vassal state. So when Ukraine inevitably says, no, we can't do that, the whole narrative flips. Russia and the U.S. can turn around and say, look, we tried. We put this amazing deal on the table. It's Kyiv that's being stubborn. Kyiv is the real obstacle to peace.
And that gives the White House the perfect excuse to say, well, if you won't negotiate, we're cutting off the aid.
That's the play. It lets the U.S. exit the conflict while framing it as Ukraine's fault. They can claim they were forced to stop the support because Ukraine refused a so-called peace deal.
That is terrifyingly plausible. It fits with that whole rhetoric we've heard about ending the war in 24 hours. I mean, if you just force one side to surrender, technically the war does end?
Right. And this trap theory is backed up by what we're seeing on the ground. Because if this was a real move towards peace, you'd expect the violence to slow down, wouldn't you?
At the very least. But we're seeing the opposite. Let's go back to that split screen. Just this past Saturday, January 24th, as delegates were packing for Abu Dhabi, Russia fired a Kh-22 missile directly at Kyiv.
And we have to talk about the Kh-22. This isn't just any missile. It's an old Soviet anti-ship missile.
Yeah.
It was designed to sink aircraft carriers. It's notoriously inaccurate against ground targets, and it has a massive warhead.
So using that against a city is not a precision strike?
No, it's an instrument of terror.
Mm-hmm.
Using that missile on a dense urban area, that is not a de-escalation signal. That is an escalation.
It's a message. We can talk, but don't forget, we can still hurt you.
It's coercive diplomacy. Russia is trying to improve its leverage at the table by terrorizing civilians. It just proves that despite the constructive words, the military logic hasn't changed. They still think they can bomb Ukraine into accepting that business deal.
And Ukraine's not just sitting there. President Zelensky came out on the 25th and announced that a document on U.S. security guarantees is ready.
Yeah. Zelensky knows he could be walking into a trap. He's trying to lock in that protection before any deal gets signed. He knows that a promise of lithium profits isn't going to stop a tank column. He needs a real binding security guarantee.
He also announced a deal with Donald Trump to get more Patriot missiles.
Which is a really crucial detail. It complicates that abandonment theory a little. It shows U.S. policy is kind of schizophrenic right now. On one hand, Witkoff and Kushner are talking business deals with Putin. On the other hand, agreements are being made to send advanced air defense systems to shoot down Russian missiles.
It's like a tug of war inside the administration itself. Is it abandonment or is it armed negotiation? Like, we'll give you missiles, but you have to sign this deal.
Exactly. But we can't just look at the big three here. Europe is watching this whole thing with a lot of anxiety. And we have to talk about Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary.
Orban has really thrown a wrench in the works, ideologically speaking. He recently proposed that Ukraine should just be a buffer zone between Russia and the West.
Buffer zone. That phrase is just loaded with so much history. It sounds like something from the Cold War.
What does that even mean in practice, to be a buffer zone?
It implies that Ukraine doesn't get to be a fully sovereign nation. It means Ukraine shouldn't be allowed to join NATO or the EU, not based on its own choices, but because its job is to keep Russia and Europe from touching. Orban's whole point is that NATO has to accept that Russia will never allow them on its border.
And that gets right to the absolute core of this conflict. Ukraine is fighting for the right to choose its own future. Orban, and you could argue the Russian position, is saying no. Your geography decides your future. You are a buffer, a cushion for the great powers.
And this is where these talks hit their biggest wall. You can talk about profit sharing and mineral rights all you want. You can swap assets for Gaza or Greenland, but you can't buy your way out of that fundamental question. Is Ukraine a sovereign nation, or is it a buffer zone subject to Russia's veto?
A question that clearly has not been answered in Abu Dhabi.
Not at all.
Right.
In fact, all this economic dazzle might be a way to distract from the fact that the answer to that question is still being decided with blood and iron. If you accept the buffer zone idea, you're basically validating the invasion.
So let's try to wrap this all up. We've got this high-stakes poker game. We've got envoys talking global real estate and mineral rights. We've got serious analysts warning of a trap. And we've got these huge, inaccurate missiles hitting a capital city.
It's a very volatile mix. It's business, diplomacy, and war all at once.
The talks are supposed to continue next week. What should we be watching for? What's the real signal in all this noise?
I'd say watch the money and watch the weapons. If the specific details of this economic framework get more concrete, if we see actual signed agreements on that 50% profit share of the mineral rights, that tells us the transactional track is winning.
And the weapons.
Watch the delivery of those Patriot missiles. Words are cheap, logistics are real. If that aid slows down while the talks drag on, or if we start hearing about delays, then that trap theory starts looking a lot more like reality. It would signal the U.S. is using aid as leverage to force Kyiv into a bad deal.
It really feels like we're watching a new kind of diplomacy take shape. It's not about values or international law. It's about the art of the deal.
Yes. And the real risk is that in focusing so much on the deal, the financials, the ROI, we lose sight of the peace. A business contract can be broken. A merger can be dissolved. But a security architecture for an entire continent needs to be built on something a little more stable than this quarter's profit projections from Ukrainian lithium.
And that's the big question I think we should leave you with today. If the U.S. and Russia are sitting there negotiating investment profits and mineral rights, are we really watching a peace process? Or are we just watching the commercialization of war? And if the deal falls through, is Ukraine being set up to take the fall?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question.
Yeah.
And the answer might be buried in the fine print.
We'll be keeping a close eye on the talks in Abu Dhabi as they continue. Until then, keep your eyes on the headlines, but always read the fine print. Thanks for listening to The Deep Dive.
Stay critical.